Hello, my name is John Hadley, and I am the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council staff lead for the Dolphin Wahoo Fishery Management Plan. The following presentation is a summary of the public hearings document that was put together for Dolphin Wahoo Amendment 10. As a general outline, I'll be going over the Fishery Management Plan amendment process, background on Amendment 10, actions that are proposed in the amendment, potential timing of the amendment, how to provide your comments to the council, and then during the live public hearing sessions that will be held via webinar, there will also be a question and answer session followed by an opportunity to provide comments to the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. So just a quick overview of where this amendment stands in the Council of Fishery Management Plan amendment process. We're getting towards the end of the amendment process for Amendment 10. As you can see here, we're in the public hearing stage where the council has developed the amendment and is taking it out to the public rather, to get input on how they've developed their actions and alternatives, as well as the preferred alternatives that they're considering. This amendment is expected to be up for final approval potentially at the council's June 2021 meeting. At this meeting, it will be the last chance for public input on the council side of the amendment process. But once this amendment is submitted to the National Marine Fisheries Service, there will be additional opportunities through the rulemaking process to make the regulation changes in the amendment go into place. Just as a reminder, for Amendment 10 and the Dolphin Wahoo Fishery Management Plan in general, it's fairly unique in that it covers Maine through the Florida Keys, so it covers several council jurisdictions. So a change to the FMP, or Fishery Management Plan, would affect some fisheries in the EEZ along the entire U.S. Atlantic coast. The South Atlantic Fishery Management Council serves as the lead management body for this Fishery Management Plan. However, it's managed in cooperation with the Mid-Atlantic and New England Fishery Management Councils through liaisons on the South Atlantic Council's Dolphin Wahoo Committee. As a little bit of background on the amendment, it was initiated in March 2016 in reaction to the commercial sector meeting its ACL and facing a harvest closure in the summer of 2015. So the council decided to re-examine the Dolphin Wahoo fishery in general and took up the issue of Amendment 10. The council moved along with developing the amendment until March 2017, but paused development of the amendment in response to revised recreational landings and recreational information that would be forthcoming from the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP, as some may be very familiar with, and that the council knew that MRIP was going to change its survey methods, which would change the recreational data and greatly affect the ability to properly analyze the actions that the council was considering. The council began working again on Amendment 10 in December 2018 and has been really developing it ever since. Of note, in April 2020, the council's Scientific and Statistical Committee recommended new acceptable biological catch levels for both dolphin and wahoo. As a reminder, dolphin and wahoo do not have stock assessments due to really issues with lack of data on the stocks, as well as the international aspects of the species migration. But the Scientific and Statistical Committee, or SSC, sets the acceptable biological catch for species that are unassessed, typically based on landings. So in the case for dolphin and wahoo, the South Atlantic Council's SSC recommended incorporating recreational landings data using the new MRIP methods, or the Fishery Effort Survey methods, include Monroe County, Florida recreational landings that had been previously left out due to issues with very differentiating landings in the Florida Keys that occurred in the South Atlantic versus the Gulf regions. The new FES methods made this easier to do. Therefore, the Monroe County recreational landings are included in the revised ABC recommendations, and thus will be included in the new annual catch limits. The other additional data that went into the new ABCs for dolphin and wahoo included the updated commercial landings data stream and a new time series that was used for setting the ABC that broadened the time series for both dolphin and wahoo to set the ABC at the third highest landings observed between 1994 and 2007. And so why is the Council taking action on Amendment 10? For one, they would like to incorporate the SSC's new catch level recommendations. This is deemed the best scientific information available. Therefore, the South Atlantic Council wants to adopt it into the Dolphin Wahoo Fishery Management Plan. They also want to address deficiencies in the recreational accountability measures, which we'll get into a little bit later. And last but not least, they're also certainly responding to public input on management changes needed in the fishery. So responding to public comments and what they're hearing that needs to be changed in the dolphin and wahoo fisheries. And so looking at the proposed actions, there are currently 13 actions in the amendment, but these actions can really be broken down into three major categories. Actions 1 through 4 accommodate the revised recreational data and catch level recommendations that I just mentioned from the Scientific and Statistical Committee. So in these actions, the Council is really adopting the best scientific information available into the Dolphin Wahoo Fishery Management Plan. They are also looking at actions that change the recreational accountability measures. These are actions 5 through 8. And also the last set of actions implement various management revisions in the Dolphin Wahoo fishery. Those are actions 9 through 13. To get into the specifics of what fall within these categories, actions 1 and 2 would revise the total annual catch limit for dolphin and wahoo. So that's the total amount that the fisheries can take annually from the dolphin or wahoo stocks, presumably with maintaining a sustainable fishery moving forward. So that's kind of the upper limit for both commercial and recreational combined. Alternatives 3 and 4 divvy up that total annual catch limit between the recreational and commercial sectors. Alternative 3 covers the sector allocations for dolphin, and alternative 4 covers the sector allocations for wahoo. The actions that cover the recreational accountability measures include a kind of a two-step process, one looking at the trigger for the accountability measure, and the other specifying what that accountability measure will be for either dolphin or wahoo. Accountability measures are meant to be put in place as temporary measures if the trigger is if the annual catch limit is exceeded. To prevent that from being exceeded consistently, accountability measures are used. So really these accountability measures are intended to be temporary measures that go into place to sort of put the brakes on the fishery with the idea of maintaining sustainable harvest in the long term. Actions, the final set of actions that implement various management revisions. There again, these are sort of management specific actions, and they respond to feedback that the Council's gotten on different aspects of the dolphin wahoo fishery. Action 9 would allow commercial vessels with trap, pot, or buoy gear on board to possess dolphin and wahoo. Action 10 removes the operator card requirement in the fishery. 11 would reduce the recreational vessel limit for dolphin. 12 reduces the recreational bag limit and establishes a recreational vessel limit for wahoo. And Action 13 would allow filleting of dolphin at sea on board charter or headboat vessels in the waters north of the Virginia-North Carolina border. So these are the waters in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. So we'll get into the details of the actions moving forward. We'll start with actions 1 through 4. Action 1 would revise the total annual catch limit for dolphin. The Council's preferred alternative is to adopt the new ACL that is equal to the updated acceptable biological catch level that was recommended by the Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee. Alternatives 3 and 4 would build up in a little bit of a buffer between the acceptable biological catch from the SSC and what would be sort of the ideal upper limit of harvest for the dolphin fishery, and that's the total fishery, including recreational and commercial landings. Alternative 3 builds in a 5% buffer between the two, and alternative 4 builds in a 10% buffer between the two. Looking at how those the new ACLs may compare to how the fishery has operated in recent years, the figure here, really what's important to pay attention to is on the right. You have the solid blue line are total landings in the fishery, and from 1986 through 2019, and on the right, the sort of dashed lines there with shapes that are horizontal and either have a circle, square, or triangle show the different, what would be the new ACLs, annual catch limits, that is, under the under Action 1, and preferred alternative 2 being the highest of these potential alternatives. Using different baseline scenarios, you can examine whether the new annual catch limits are likely to be met. The table in front of you has 3 different scenarios, one using the average over the past 5 years, the other uses the average over the past 3 years, and then the far right scenario there, you have a maximum landing scenario. So those are based on the highest observed landings in the fishery. So if you assume the average landings over the past 5 years or past 3 years will apply moving forward, the ACLs are not expected to be met. If you use a maximum landing scenario, so the highest landings observed in recent years, and really this analysis is picking up on the 2015 bump in landings that was observed, and then landings have kind of fallen since then. But if you examine that year, the new ACLs would have been met sometime later in the year, likely in the fall. Action 2 is a similar action in that, but this applies to wahoo. So the council is setting the new annual catch limits for wahoo to reflect the updated annual biological catch, the recommendation that they received from their scientific and statistical committee. In this case, they also selected alternative 2 as their preferred alternative, and this would set the annual catch limit equal to the updated acceptable biological catch level. At the similar figure here, as was shown, this is for wahoo this time. There again, focusing on the right side of this figure or graph, you can see that the solid blue line shows landings overall, and the horizontal sort of dotted shaped lines show what the different alternatives and how they would compare to recent landings. And you can see as if these landings would have been in place in the past, in the recent past, the ACLs would have been exceeded in approximately 3 of the past 5 years. There were observed increased landings in 2015, 2016, and 2017. However, since then, landings have fallen below what would be the new annual catch limits. And this is an important point because we'll come back to this a couple times in the amendment when we speak about specifying accountability measures for the recreational sector, as well as the vessel and bag limit action for wahoo. Similar analysis here as was shown before. There's a table that uses different baseline scenarios to see how landings may stack up to the new annual catch limits. Using a 5-year average, the annual catch limits are expected to be met, but likely later in the year, looking at a late November or December timeframe. Based on the 3-year average, the ACLs will not be met based on the landings over the most recent 3 years. And that maximum landing scenario, so almost like the highest case scenario when the fishery is operating at its recent peak or recent observed peak, if that were to occur, you would see the ACL being met sometime in the late summer or early fall. And so those are the actions 1 and 2 cover the total annual catch limits. Actions 3 and 4 looked at sector allocations and the resulting sector annual catch limits. So how that total ACL is split into sector ACLs. Under alternative 1, the current sector allocations would remain for dolphin under action 3, and this allocation is 90% to the recreational sector, 10% to the commercial sector, keeping in mind that these percentages will be applied to the preferred alternative in action 1. And so your overall ACL is increasing. Alternative 2 would allocate 93.75% to the recreational sector and 6.25% to the commercial sector. This is based on maintaining the current annual catch limit approximately the same on a pound basis, and then allocating the remaining what is remaining of the ACL to the recreational sector. Alternative 3, which is the council's preferred alternative, would allocate 93% of the total ACL to the recreational sector and 7% to the commercial sector. This is based on the council's intent to explore alternatives that would not result in a decrease in current pounds of dolphin available to either sector. So in this case, both the recreational and commercial sectors would see a notable increase in the ACL, in the sector ACLs on a pound basis. And alternative 4 is similar. However, it would be a 92-8 split, with 92% going to the recreational sector and 8% going to the commercial sector. Looking at how these potential new ACLs stack up to the sector-based landings, the figure in front of you shows recreational landings over the past 10 years. And you can see in most years there would be a pretty good buffer, 5 million pounds plus, between the observed landings and what would be the new annual catch limits for the recreational sector, with the exception of 2015, where you did have a bump, a 1-year spike in landings that are above the observed landings are above the alternatives being considered. And this is for the recreational sector. This figure is a similar figure, however, it covers the commercial sector ACLs and those alternatives in comparison to commercial landings for dolphin. As you can see in the figure here, it shows that all of the alternatives being considered by the council would fall above observed landings, or at least recent observed landings, in the commercial fishery. So when looking at analysis of how the new sector annual catch limits will stack up against the recreational sector and commercial sector landings in recent years, the 5-year and 3-year average were examined, and using that as a baseline, neither the recreational nor the commercial sector are expected to reach their respective sector ACLs under any of the alternatives specified. Using a maximum landing scenario, so that kind of high-end estimate or highest end estimate, the commercial sector is still not expected to reach its annual catch limit. However, the recreational sector, there again in that high landing scenario, would meet its sector ACL sometime in the fall. Moving over to Wahoo, Action 4 specifies sector allocations and sector annual catch limits for Wahoo. Currently, the annual catch limit for Wahoo is split 96.07 recreational and 3.93 commercial. Alternative 2 would set the allocation for Wahoo based on the total catch between 1994 and 2007. These are the same baseline years that the Scientific and Statistical Committee used when setting the acceptable biological catch for Wahoo. Alternative 3 sets the ACL based on maintaining the current annual catch limit on a pound basis and allocating the remainder of the new annual catch limit to the recreational sector. And Alternative 4 finds sort of a middle ground there and a nice round number of 97% to the recreational sector, 3% to the commercial sector. I should mention all of the alternatives being examined include annual catch limits that would raise the ACLs, or annual catch limits, for both the recreational and commercial sectors. When looking at how the new recreational sector annual catch limits stack up against recent landings, this figure shows recent recreational landings on the dotted or dashed line, and then the solid horizontal lines that are kind of all stacked together are the new annual catch limits. As mentioned, in sort of average normal years, recreational landings of wahoo are below the new annual catch limits. However, there was the recent observed spike, multi-year spike of 2015, 2016, and 2017, where the observed landings fell above what would be the new annual catch limits. Moving over to a similar figure, but this for the commercial sector, under almost all years, the new annual catch limits would not be met, with the exception of potentially if the council chose alternative 3, the 2019 landings, the preliminary 2019 landings are above that level, but just slightly. So in most years, you can expect a buffer between the commercial sector ACL for Wahoo and the observed landings. Showing this in a table format, the commercial sector is not expected to be reached under a 5-year average landing scenario, a 3-year average landing scenario, or the maximum landing scenario. So all of the sectors, commercial sector ACLs being considered, are not expected to be reached, with the exception of alternative 3. However, for preferred alternative 4, there will likely be a buffer regardless of the baseline that you use for analysis. For the recreational sector, the outcome is quite different. Using the 5-year average landings, the ACL is expected to be met for preferred alternative 4 as well as the other alternatives. However, it would likely be met late in the year. If you use the 3, if you examine the landings over the past 3 years, so the average over the past 3 years, then the ACLs would not be met. However, if you use a maximum landing scenario, so that highest observed value, in years when the fishery is really firing on all cylinders, so to speak, you'd see the recreational sector ACL met sometime in the fall. Moving along to actions 5 through 8, where actions 1 through 4 covered ACLs and accountability measure, or in ACLs and sector allocations rather. The next set of actions cover accountability measures. And so action 5 would revise the trigger for the postseason recreational accountability measures for dolphin. Really, the crux of the issue here that the council is trying to correct is something within the accountability measure that specifies that the trigger for the accountability measure, or AM, would only be tripped, so to speak, if the species is deemed overfished. Since there is not a stock assessment expected for a dolphin, it's unlikely that that the species would be deemed overfished. Therefore, the council is trying to address this. And I'm going to jump to a summary table that goes over all of the alternatives being considered, just because it's a little bit easier for comparison purposes. But under alternative 1, the current trigger for the postseason accountability measure occurs if the total and recreational sector ACL is exceeded and dolphin are deemed overfished. There again, that overfished language is really what the council is trying to address. Alternative 2 would use a 3-year geometric mean of recreational landings and compare that to the sector ACL to specify whether the accountability measure would be put in place. Accountability measure would be put in place for the recreational sector. Alternative 3 is also a multi-year trigger for the accountability measure, but this uses a 3-year summed total in comparison to the 3-year sum of the recreational sector ACL. So 3-year sum of the landings exceeds 3-year sum of the ACLs, then an AM would go into play, accountability measure would go into place. Again, accountability measures being temporary measures. Alternative 4, the AM would go into place if recreational landings exceed the sector ACL 2 times in a 3-year time period, or the total ACL is exceeded in a single year. The council's preferred alternative 5, would implement a trigger for the recreational accountability measure that would go into place if the total ACL, or recreational and commercial landings combined, exceed the total ACL. In alternative 6, recreational landings would exceed the sector ACL, and that would be a trigger for the trigger for alternative 6. Moving on to action 6, so we're moving from the trigger into specifying what the accountability measure would be. I'm going to again jump ahead to a summary table of the actions being considered, but really alternative 1, the postseason accountability measure, as it's currently specified, would reduce the sector ACL by any overage of the ACL. So if the recreational sector exceeded its ACL, that would be subtracted from the sector annual catch limit. And then the fishing season would be reduced accordingly to ensure that the reduced ACL is not exceeded. Alternative 2 would reduce the fishing season to prevent the sector ACL from being exceeded. So just reduce the fishing season outright, but this would not include any sort of payback provisions. There would be no reduced sector ACL under alternative 2. Alternative 3 would reduce the bag limit as the accountability measure. Alternative 4 would reduce the vessel limit as the accountability measure. And preferred alternative 5, the council's preferred alternative, really is a combination of different aspects of 1 through 4. In this accountability measure, once triggered, landings would be monitored, essentially for persistent increase in landings, and if they were projected to still reach the sector ACL, there would potentially be an implementation of an in-season bag limit reduction or in-season vessel limit reduction to sort of pump the brakes and slow down harvest if there was time to do so. And if still necessary, reduce the fishing season to prevent the sector ACL from being exceeded. So really, when you talk about reducing the fishing season, you're basically saying harvest is closed as of a given date, and that would remain in place through the end of the calendar year. Moving on to action 7, actions 5 and 6 cover dolphin. We're now going to cover wahoo, looking at the triggers for the accountability measure and then specifying the accountability measure itself. Here again, in the wahoo accountability measure language, we have that kind of the overfished language within there, which is an issue that the council is trying to address, since wahoo is also a species that it does not have an assessment. Thus, it is not likely to be deemed overfished. So that's an issue that the council is trying to address. And additionally, for a wahoo, the specification is to reduce the annual catch limit, but there's no mechanism to implement any sort of real restriction on harvest as part of the accountability measure if this is needed. So that's another issue that the council is trying to clarify. And so moving ahead, rather than going through all of the language of each alternative, I'll provide a summary. But under alternative 1, the trigger for the postseason accountability measure is that the total and sector ACL is exceeded, and the wahoo are deemed overfished. And there again, that overfished language is the crux of the issue. The council's preferred alternative 2 would use a 3-year geometric mean to compare that to the sector ACL. So if the 3-year geometric mean of recreational landings exceeds the sector ACL, then that would be the trigger for the accountability measure. Alternative 3 compares a 3-year sum of total recreational landings to the 3-year sum total of the sector ACL. Alternative 4, if the sector ACL is exceeded in 2 of the most previous 3 years, or if the total ACL is exceeded, the accountability measure would go in place. Alternative 5, the accountability measure would be triggered if commercial and recreational landings exceed the total ACL. So the total, the total ACL is exceeded. That's when the recreational accountability measure would be triggered. And alternative 6, if the recreational sector exceeded its sector ACL. Moving on to action 8, you have a similar set of alternatives here. So I will jump ahead to the summary table. However, the council is only looking at 4 alternatives here instead of 5 as they are for dolphin, but the council has currently chosen alternative 2 as their preferred alternative. And so if the recreational accountability measure were triggered in the following year, the fishing season would be reduced by the amount necessary to keep the recreational sector within the annual catch limit. Alternative 3 would look at reducing the bag limit. Alternative 4 look at reducing the vessel limit. So we've covered the actions for annual catch limits and sector allocations. We've covered the actions that cover accountability measures. Now we're going to jump into the set of actions that implement various management changes in the fishery. And there again, these are really brought on in response to public comments on what needs to be changed in the Dolphin Wahoo fishery. So action 9 covers allowing trap pot or buoy gear on board, or allowing the possession of commercial quantities of dolphin and wahoo when trap pot or buoy gear is on board a vessel. And these dolphin or wahoo would need to still be caught by rod and reel. However, currently, you can see the list of authorized gears there. Within that list that list does not include trap pot or buoy gear. Thus, if that gear is on a vessel, dolphin or wahoo should not be possessed. Alternative 2 is one of the council's preferred alternatives for this measure. Then this would allow vessels with trap, pot, or buoy gear on board, and this includes gear used in the spiny lobster fishery to retain dolphin caught by rod and reel while in possession of these quote-unquote prohibited gears, or currently prohibited gears. And within this, for vessels that had the trap, pot, or buoy gear on board, there would be a commercial trip limit for dolphin at 500 pounds. Moving along, the council's other preferred alternative for this is preferred alternative 3, and this is similar to preferred alternative 2, but it would essentially allow the possession of wahoo when trap, pot, or buoy gear are on board a vessel. As a little bit of background on this action, it was added at a request from the Atlantic Offshore Lobstermen's Association, where this association requested that the council modify the regulations to allow the historic practice of harvesting dolphin while in the possession of lobster pots to continue. Some of these vessels were going between sets and potentially trolling between sets or catching dolphin off of their buoys, off of the lobster pot buoys, and wanted to continue to be able to do so. So that's why the council is considering this action in the amendment. Looking at some of this, the logbook information, it does indicate that there are both dolphin and wahoo landings on board vessels that have buoy, buoy or trap gear on board. However, these landings are fairly minimal. So the take-home point being here is this will not likely lead to a large increase in commercial landings of either dolphin or wahoo based on historic landings. Additionally, the council has put in place a 500-pound trip limit for dolphin in these situations, and the existing trip limit for wahoo of 500 pounds would be in place as a measure, really just in case, to make sure that there's not an unexpected increase through this regulatory change, an unexpected increase in commercial landings through this regulatory change. Action 10 would remove the operator card requirement in the Dolphin Wahoo fishery. Currently, for the for-hire or commercial Dolphin Wahoo permit to be valid, an operator or crew member must hold a valid operator card from either the Southeast Regional Office or Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office. Preferred Alternative 2 removes this requirement for the for-hire sector. Preferred Alternative 3 removes this requirement for the commercial sector. Looking at the little bit of background on this action, public testimony has indicated that operator cards are rarely checked by law enforcement and are burdensome to renew. The National Marine Fisheries Service Office of Law Enforcement has given a presentation to the South Atlantic Council on operator cards. And in doing so, it was mentioned that currently the operator cards are not really being used for gathering information, distributing information, or enforcement to a large extent, which was really the reason they were put in place in the first place. So the council has selected to remove the operator card requirement for the for-hire and commercial sectors. Looking at how many vessels this may affect overall, you're looking at approximately 4,070 vessels And looking at some of the cumulative annual benefits, so kind of the direct and the direct savings and time savings, and putting a dollar value to that, you're looking at about approximately a $370,000 a year economic benefit from this action. Moving on to action 11, which would reduce the recreational vessel limit for dolphin. Alternative 1 would maintain the current 10 fish per person bag limit for dolphin, not to exceed 60 fish per vessel. And the exemption for head boats, where the vessel limit exemption, I should specify, for head boats will remain of 10 dolphin per paying passenger. Would remain in place under all of the alternatives being considered. So really what's being focused on here is a potential vessel limit a reduction for hire vessels, charter vessels specifically, so 6-packs, if you will, or specifically uninspected vessels, and then private recreational vessels. And so alternative 2 considers reducing the bag limit, not reducing the bag limit, reducing the vessel limit, but maintaining the bag limit. And the new vessel limit would fall between 30 and 54 fish. This would apply in the entire Atlantic EEZ under alternative 2. Alternative 3 is very similar. The new vessel limit would fall between 30 and 54 fish, depending on the subalternative chosen. However, this would apply only off of Florida. In alternative 4, similarly, the revised and reduced vessel limit would fall between 30 and 54 fish per vessel. However, this vessel limit would only apply in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And so you'll notice there are various regional components to Action 11. One of the reasons for this is that the Council has received varying public comments and varying regional inputs from those comments. So in general, a lot of the comments coming from anglers and for-hire captains in the South Florida region in particular, including the Florida Keys, is that there's a large concern over dolphin and potentially to look towards implementing lower retention limits for dolphin to address, or at least help address, some of the abundance issues that they're seeing for dolphin in that region, and really concerned for the dolphin stock. Overall, the council has also received comments from particularly the for-hire sector and for-hire captains in North Carolina, indicating that the 60-fish vessel limit is very important to them, particularly because it helps to market and sell dolphin-specific trips. So the council has received sort of varying regional comments on this action, and that's one of the reasons that they have various regional components to it. However, looking at how the potential the potential vessel limits would play out, and the likely effects would be the bag limits of 30 fish per vessel have not yet been examined. Nor has alternative 4, which would cover the South Carolina through Florida area. These analyses are pending and will be available for the Council's March 2021 meeting. But based on the data that has been analyzed, looking at a 40-fish vessel limit in the Atlantic, this would implement approximately a 6% reduction in dolphin harvest on the recreational side, which would equate to approximately 1 million pounds. If this were to be implemented in Florida only, the reduction becomes much lower. And really, you're looking at approximately a 0.04% reduction, an approximate reduction of about 6,000, 7,000 pounds. So the take-home point being there is a major difference between implementing a vessel limit reduction throughout the Atlantic versus implementing a vessel reduction in Florida only. Moving on to Action 12, this would reduce the recreational vessel, or the recreational bag limit rather, for wahoo, and also establish a recreational vessel limit for wahoo. Currently, the recreational daily bag limit is 2 wahoo per person, and there is no recreational vessel limit for wahoo. Alternative 2 would reduce the recreational daily bag limit to 1 wahoo per person. Alternative 3 would implement a vessel limit ranging between 2 and 8 wahoo per vessel. And really, one of the reasons that the council is considering this is that the wahoo, there's concern over the new recreational sector annual catch limit and wahoo landings in recent years. And so, as noted earlier, wahoo landings have exceeded what will be the new recreational sector annual catch limit in 3 of the past 5 years of available landings data. A reduction in the bag limit, which is alternative 2, or implementing a vessel limit, which is alternative 3, may be necessary to prevent the recreational sector from exceeding the sector annual catch limit and triggering restrictive management measures through the accountability measure. Analysis for Action 12 is pending. This is an action that the council added at their December 2021 meeting, and this analysis will be available for review by the available for review by the council at the March 2021 meeting. Last but not least in the amendment is Action 13, and this would allow filleting of dolphin at sea on board for hire vessels in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. Currently, dolphin possessed in the Atlantic EEZ must be maintained with head and fins intact, with some exceptions for fish lawfully harvested from the Bahamas. However, fish harvested from the Atlantic EEZ can be eviscerated, gilled, and scaled, but must otherwise be maintained in a whole condition. And so this is alternative 1, the no action alternative, and this is the current preferred of the council. Alternative 2 would provide an exemption on board for hire vessels in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions to allow dolphin to be filleted at sea under the following provisions of subalternative 2A, where the skin would need to remain intact on the entire fillet. This is for species identification purposes, and also subalternative 2B, 2 fillets of dolphin, regardless of the length of each fillet, would be equivalent to 1 dolphin, and that's for enforcing bag limits. The council, this is another action that the council has had sort of a varying response and varying advice on. The action was added in response to a request from the Mid-Atlantic Council that the South Atlantic Council and the Southeast Regional Office consider providing an exemption of filleting dolphin or mahi-mahi at sea in the waters north of Cape Hatteras. The request was to allow crew to keep working during long runs back to port and shorten the wait time for customers at the dock upon arrival. As mentioned, the council has received varying feedback on this. It was generally approved by law enforcement in the Greater Atlantic region, and also it was generally favorably looked upon by the South Atlantic Council's Dolphin Wahoo Advisory Panel. The other side of the coin, so to speak, law enforcement in the South Atlantic region has been against moving forward with this action. It has been generally opposed by law enforcement at the Southeast Regional Office, and also the Council's Law Enforcement Advisory Panel has advised against allowing filleting of dolphin at sea. Overall, this action could benefit the for-hire sector and certainly customers on for-hire trips. However, it also places additional burden on law enforcement boarding officers and adds to the complexity of regulations, since you would have different regulations for dolphin depending on the region. It would allowing filleting at sea would also reduce the size and weight measurements for recreational catches due to fewer measurements being collected dockside by creel surveyors. And so overall, taking this into account in the varying opinions and as well as advice that have been given to the council's current preferred action on this is the no action alternative. And so, keeping in mind that what has been presented is the Council's current considerations and action, or in Amendment 10 rather, and the Council's current preferred alternatives for most of the actions. These preferred alternatives could change between now and when the Council goes for final approval later this year on the amendment. Looking at the potential timing for the amendment, the Council will be reviewing public hearing comments received as well as revised analyses at their March 2021 meeting, and then potentially voting on final approval of the amendment at the June 2021 meeting. Afterwards, the amendment would be prepared and sent to the National Marine Fisheries Service for implementation, likely sometime in 2022. That's when the regulatory changes would take place. And so, what do you think the Council should do? That's this is the getting information on and input on what the Council should do is really the main reason for taking these amendments out to public hearings. So the Council wants to hear from you. Do you agree with the Council's preferred alternatives? Do you not agree with the Council's preferred alternatives? And are there other alternatives that should be considered? There are several opportunities to provide public comments to the Council during public hearings. There will be 3 webinar sessions on June 26th, 27th, and 28th, all starting at 6 p.m. Additionally, the public hearing summary, the presentation slides, and this recorded presentation will be available on the Council's website. Written comments, for those that don't want to submit verbal comments during the public hearing sessions or can't make those sessions, the Council does certainly take written comments as well. The preferred method is the online public comment form, which is available on the Council's webpage. Comments may also be submitted by mail to the following address or submitted by fax. All written comments are requested to be received by 5 p.m. on February 5th, and that's so they can be read, summarized, and available for the Council ahead of their March 2021 meeting, which occurs the first week of March. And so if there's something that was not covered or you have more questions, feel free to contact me, John Hadley, for any questions on Dolphin Wahoo Amendment 10. For general questions on the South Atlantic Council, you can reach out to Cameron Rhodes, who is our Fishery Outreach Specialist, or Kim Iverson, who is our Public Information Officer on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council staff. And so that is all for this presentation. Thank you very much.